Hey, I'm Smooneychad, and this is Modded Kerbal Spaceberg. Today we're going to be trying to use a plane, of course, to fly and capture an asteroid. And things might not go exactly as expected along the way, but by the end of the episode, we'll be one step closer to beating the game using aircraft only. At the end of the last episode, we hit a little bit of a roadblock. We really need to upgrade the Research and Development Center before we continue any farther, especially into the plane part of the tech tree. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up the nerve engine and a bunch of other nodes with the science that we got from the last mission, and that's going to hopefully help us complete this contract, which is to bring 2 tourists to an asteroid, and they're going to pay us nearly $1 million Kerbucks for that. That's $1 million Kerbucks that can be put right toward upgrading the Research and Development Center. So we're going to go ahead and pick up some grabbing units and find a suitable asteroid to grab. And we're going to try to find an asteroid that's on the smaller side, so like a Class A or B, and not one of the ones like a Class E, which is absolutely massive and will be really hard to push around. And so we're going to try to find like a B or an A size asteroid that's getting as close into orbit around Kerbin as you can possibly get. So basically that U-shaped orbit there is as close to being a circle or an ellipse as it possibly can be. That one didn't look too good, but this one ended up looking a lot better. As you can see, the orbit is polar, but it's very, very close to being in orbit. Just a small nudge, and this thing will be into a high elliptical orbit around Kerbin. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Now it's just a matter of upgrading some existing hardware with the ability to capture it, and of course accommodate 3 tourists along the way. And we need to put that grabbing stuff there, so we're going to go ahead and put a piston here, and then put a grabbing unit on top of that, and then completely cheaty part clip it right down into the tourist habitation unit there. Yeah, if you look away if you don't like part clipping, I had nowhere else to really put it. I suppose I could have put it a little bit farther back, but I really wanted to keep it as close to the center of mass of the plane as possible to maybe make moving the asteroid around a little bit easier. And you can see I'm making some serious upgrades to the Tawaki carrier aircraft there, and we're actually going to put a main cell, single engine on the back rather than that cluster that we had. And of course some new air intakes, and yeah, it turns out those air intakes weren't quite enough to just push this to full throttle on launch, and it had the unintended side effect of showing us that apparently our taxiways have absolutely no collision. At least right now they don't have any collision. This is a recurring problem in this episode. I have no idea what was going on, but I didn't want to restart my game, so we're going with the glitches that we have, which are quite a few. I mean, all the trees turn into these weird little emblems, and I have no idea what they were. Probably some like texture placeholder thing. I have absolutely no idea, and I've never seen anyone else show that. But yeah, this is a glitchy episode, fair warning. KSP 2 levels of glitchy. Luckily, everything seemed to be fixed on the restart, but unfortunately, I didn't actually restart the game until after this episode, so it's going to be a glitchy one. We're going to go ahead and immediately turn toward the north because we are actually launching for the first time into a polar orbit, which made me slightly worried because I've been trying to land the Tawaki carrier aircraft here only at round range because I've kind of decided in the lore of the Aircraft Only series that the Tawaki is supported by round range, and that's the place where they land at and get refurbished and everything. It's sent back out after that, and that the Cole Parasite aircraft on the top there gets supported by Sandy Island. So they land at Sandy Island, the Tawaki lands at round range. So I was worried about if we go into a polar orbit, how is that going to work out? Am I even going to be able to land anywhere? Because there's a lot more launch sites around the equator, and I'm not necessarily guaranteed to find one on the way back down. So here we are basically getting into orbit. This thing could probably SSTO if I really needed it to, but why do that when you can just carry more payload suborbitally? It's basically like a first stage on a rocket, and then this is the second stage that we're about to release, and it just bumps itself the rest of the way in orbit. Here's a quick shot over top of the polar vortex, which ended up looking extremely cool, and here we are releasing that second stage aircraft there, which is going to bump itself the rest of the way into orbit, and the Tawaki is hopefully going to land. And see, there's a bit of a problem here. We only have one little nerve engine, and this thing needs to get all the way into orbit before we can switch back to the Tawaki and land it. So we have to do the entire orbital insertion burn before the Tawaki hits any atmosphere. And of course I could use FMRS that I recently got, which allows you to do 100% reusable stages like this, but I'd like to do it the old school way just to prove that I can. And it turns out that in this polar trajectory and everything, we actually ended up coming really close to round range with the Tawaki when we switched back to it. So I immediately navigated to it and thus began the process of actually finding it. Round range kind of sets in a big bowl in the mountains, and it's a bit difficult to find, especially at the nighttime with the clouds and stuff, but we did eventually line up for it, and we ended up having to take the short runway instead of the much longer runway, which I think would be much better suited for space planes. So we come in here for a janky landing as always, and nearly go off the runway. But if you notice here, despite all of the jankiness of this landing, we don't actually ever go in the grass. Just barely, the left wheel there was still on the runway. So I call that a full success, and we always get a really good amount of money back from those launches, and we'll get even more if we actually decide to open up one of those officially. Here's our coal in a nice polar orbit that's lining up pretty darn well with the asteroid's eventual orbit. And as I was checking over the craft here and making sure everything was okay, we got an incredibly weird visual glitch that I have absolutely no idea what caused it. And right after that, I ended up finding out that we have absolutely no monopropellant on board, which should make rendezvousing with an asteroid fairly fun. But back to the mission, we're going to be using my method of rendezvousing with asteroids, which is probably not the best or anything, but it's what I usually do to rendezvous with them. We're going to put ourselves in a nice little parking orbit around Kerbin that roughly matches the periapsis of the asteroid. And then we're going to match up the inclination and everything until all we have to do when the asteroid comes around is one singular prograde burn out to it. So you'll basically be able to see what I'm talking about here. We matched our inclination up until it's basically 0 degrees there, and then we're roughly matching the periapsis down there of the big gigantic green orbit. And now we're going to actually use this to tell exactly how long we need to wait before we make our burn to meet up with the asteroid. I make a maneuver node at the periapsis of the asteroid and then drag that out until the apoapsis is right at the point that the asteroid enters Kerbin's sphere of influence, which is right here, and we actually reach that point in 22 days if we made the burn now. So that means we need to make sure that the asteroid is 22 days from getting to that point or entering Kerbin's sphere of influence before we make that burn, so we get there at the exact same time. So we're going to zoom out a little bit here and warp until the Kerbin encounter of that asteroid that you can see in the distance there is at roughly 22 days. And then we're going to go ahead and make our maneuver node. And as you can see, we got a very nice and close intersect with the asteroid, which is exactly what we're looking for, of course. So we're going to go ahead and make our burn there and do some fine adjustments by turning down the thrust limiter on the engine and doing some really fine maneuvers there because we are really far out there and just the smallest touch from your engine can make a big difference. We got really close to the asteroid within 26 kilometers. We'll go ahead and float out pretty darn close to it before we do any more maneuvers. No matter what you're rendezvousing with, whether it be planet or spacecraft or asteroid, the closer you are, the less efficient maneuvers are, but the easier they are, especially when they're very, very fine ones like this one. You can see it moving there in the distance thanks to a Distant Object Enhancer, great mod for stuff like this. And we have a very close velocity to it, and we just need to burn that velocity off and fully match this asteroid up. And of course, approach it slowly. We're not trying to recreate the DART mission or anything. So we're going to, as slowly as possible, approach this and be very careful because if you remember from earlier, we have absolutely no monopropellant. It turns out, monopropellant drains evenly and doesn't obey crossfeed rules between crafts, which absolutely sucks. So the Tawaki actually sucked up all of the monopropellant in this spacecraft. So we're going to have to do a little flip here and just slowly approach the asteroid there. And we're not going to be completely lined up with the asteroid's center of mass or anything, but we did actually make it happen. And I was really worried that we wouldn't be able to rendezvous with this thing at all, let alone grab it with no monopropellant or anything. All of this would have been a lot easier with monopropellant and RCS systems hooked up. But we did grab it, and our tourists are getting their 14 minutes of fame with the asteroid. I guess they're taking selfies with it, and I don't know what they're doing. They didn't actually get out of the plane, so I guess they're just looking at it through the windows and taking selfies. That's about all they could do. But we have more plans for this asteroid. We're going to try to capture it, of course, and either put it into a polar station or, land it. Easier said than done, though, because if you know anything about physics, you probably know what's going to be happening whenever we fire up this engine. We're going to start spinning rapidly. Luckily, though, the coal here has some pretty darn strong reaction wheels. You can see them right there on the sides of the ship. And they should be able to counter that slightly so we can burn with a reduced thrust and not go spinning wildly, which is It's just wild to even see that working properly. So the burns were about as painful as you could imagine. So we're going to use this little trick here to lower our orbit instead of burning for all of it, which is spinning around and using the asteroid itself as a heat shield to air brake, which it turns out is incredibly effective, and we are way past being captured. We're almost in low Kerbin orbit completely, and it's about the coolest thing I've ever done. It's right up there with flying through an eclipse at Mach Jesus. It's very, very cool using an asteroid as a heat shield, but we're left with a choice right here. And I put up a poll to ask you guys whether I should land it or make it a polar orbit station. And to my surprise, everyone pretty much chose to make it a polar orbit station. But for those few like me that wanted to see it be landed, we're going to do that anyway. We'll just pretend that we're doing that in the simulator, if you would, because we're going to go back and make it a polar orbit station, which turns out to be pretty useful in its own regard. But of course, this is going to be a pretty dangerous mission in and of itself, trying to land this thing, because obviously this plane is not going to want to fly with a 14-ton asteroid on its back. So we end up having a bit of a problem with it spinning around in circles, but we did actually lower our speed down to nearly below 100 meters per second before we had to finally disconnect from this at around 2,000 meters. And I was trying to disconnect from it, let the asteroid drop into the ocean and hopefully survive, and then get control of the coal aircraft again. But the aircraft was not wanting to get any kind of semblance of control. The asteroid survived down there, as you could see, but it was a really, really big struggle trying to get this thing to stabilize. Luckily, like 300 meters above the ocean, it finally stabilized enough until we were able to fly it. I just didn't really have enough control authority here, going only 60 meters per second, to pull this thing up and keep it from hitting the ocean too hard. We did survive, though. The entire crew survived, and the asteroid actually survived. So I actually did manage to land this thing properly without any parachutes, just flying it down more or less to the surface. But we are just going to put this in a polar orbit, a very close, low polar orbit, at around exactly 100,000 meters or 100 kilometers above Kerbin. And now that we have it circularized up here, we're going to rename it to something a little bit better than AIU-AA8. And that's going to be Stony Station. I thought that was a perfect little name for a tiny little asteroid in polar orbit, which we're hopefully going to make some kind of station around in the future. I think that'd be pretty cool to make it a fuel depot of some kind. And it's kind of funny just having this thing orbiting up there. With everything done, we're going to go ahead and land those tourists that we took up to the asteroid. And I'm using the angle of attack hold function of Atmosphere Autopilot here, which is really, really handy for re-entries like this. You can see it just keeps the angle dead on. And all you have to do with that is just bank it to the left or the right, and you can pretty much steer wherever you want to go within a certain range. Very, 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 very handy. And right around here, I switched over to just the standard fly-by-wire mode, which is like a much better SAS, like a much, much better SAS for airplanes. And I think I always vastly overestimate how well this thing can glide. I knew I needed some more speed than this to make it to the actual runway, because I did come in a little bit short of it. But I didn't really realize how low I was coming in. Much like the landing in the last video, I came in way, way, way too low and slow at this thing, because it really doesn't have that much wing area for the weight and size of it, especially since it's half full right now. But luckily, the runway didn't have any collision, so none of this really mattered. I just went through the ground and landed on the ground beneath. I have no idea why the statics were missing collision. Just some of the statics were missing collisions. The taxiways at the KSC, the runway here, those did over there. Those had collision, the buildings next to us, but I guess we got the plane back okay, and so everyone's good, and this glitch didn't reappear, so we're good. Here's all of our tourists who have paid us very, very well. All in all, it's ended up being over 2 million Kerbucks, which is more than enough to go ahead and finally max out the R&D center, meaning that the only thing between us and completely beating the game is an absolutely absurd amount of science points. And to get started on that, we're going to go ahead and go on a little bit of a shopping spree and pick up some engine nodes that I wanted, as well as many science experiments as I can possibly get out of what science I have right now, because that always leads to getting more science down the road. Unfortunately, this strategy has kind of left the program broke for the time being, so we're going to go ahead and upgrade the SO9 Coal here for a MUN mission, a complete money grab of a MUN mission. We're going to pack in every single science experiment, including the surface ones, that we have available to us and just send this thing to the Mun, since we still haven't actually gone to the Mun yet, landed on the surface at least. We should be able to get a good amount of science out of this. I also had to double up the thrust, as you probably noticed there, because otherwise I don't think we actually had enough thrust to get on and off of the Mun, so that would have been a little bit of an issue. I also upgraded the aerodynamics, so hopefully this thing lands a little bit better than the previous versions of it. And of course, we're going to go ahead and upgrade the carrier aircraft, the Tawaki, with 2 gigantic ramjet engines. These are the Valkyrie ramjet engines from, I believe it's Near Future Aeronautics. They're basically just gigantic whiplash engines, and they are incredibly powerful. It's definitely a lot better than having to cluster like 8 whiplash engines on this thing to actually get it off of the ground. It's a lot more efficient this way, just having 3 engines all together now on the Tawaki. And it's took the Tawaki from being just barely maybe an SSTO to being a full-fledged SSTO in its own right. Even though we don't really want it to be an SSTO, I never designed it to be one, which isn't necessarily a problem, but we're going to keep it suborbital and just use some of the fuel in the coal there to kick it all the way to a full orbit. Especially now that we have a little bit more thrust, it's a lot easier to get this thing into orbit and just do the insertion burn and then switch back to the Tawaki like we did before. And of course, we're going to be flying this back to Round Range, which is the official handler of the Tawaki carrier aircraft. It's going to be the place that refurbishes them and sends them back out. I guess they fly them out to the KSC for launch. I don't know. We should probably open up these places as like official launch sites so we can actually launch from them too. That'd be pretty darn cool. And just like before, I'm using the auto angle of attack hold feature of Atmosphere Autopilot here. And I think it's pretty cool that while we're steering down to Round Range, you can see that we're actually almost keeping pace with the coal that we released and is now in orbit. That is pretty cool. It's just flying above us there. But we're coming in for a direct line up with Round Range, and it's constantly kind of perpetually covered in clouds here at low altitude. But that actually gave us a really awesome shot of the Tawaki piercing the clouds, still going well over supersonic at this point. We ended up coming in really hot toward the runway, so I had to actually do a couple of turns around the runway and around the complex before we bled off enough speed to actually land. I need to have some kind of air braking feature for this other than the drogue chutes, which I ended up using for this landing here. And I think this ended up being probably the best landing of the Tawaki yet. Usually the landings are really janky, but this one actually ended up coming out pretty nice, and it immediately started raining right after we landed. But once we recover the Tawaki, we are greeted with 100,000 funds recovered from the parts there, which is really great that we're getting all that money back, because that would be a lot of money spent. You may notice that we're now floating around in IVA, and this is Jeb going back to check on Bob and Bill back here, which we are, of course, bringing with us to the Mun, because they're going to help us put together some surface science and everything. They're just chilling back here in this huge crew compartment with plenty of extra room to spare and plenty of luggage for them. I went ahead and just made a quick little transfer to the Mun, which, you know, you don't have to really make a transfer node to the Mun or anything, but I wanted to make sure that we got a pretty precise, very close pass to the Mun without wasting too much Delta V, because I've got a plan to maybe do multiple landings on this mission. And of course, landing with this is going to be a little bit weird, even if we do have enough thrust, because we don't have any way of like really rotating it quickly other than the reaction wheels, so it's going to be pretty interesting to see how this turns out. We're just going to go ahead and capture into Mun orbit and immediately just keep burning down to a landing spot. We don't really care where we land at, as long as there's some kind of natural ramp near to kind of get this thing back up into orbit, or at least a suborbital trajectory to the next landing. And I found this perfect crater rim that I landed at, which basically gives us a huge launch ramp once we're done with the little mission at this landing side. And as predicted, the landing is a little bit tricky since this is a plane and it's not actually meant to land on its butt, really. And given that I designed this specifically for this Mun mission, it looks like I would have actually thought about the whole butt landing there, but I didn't, and it actually lands on its tail fins, and it's a little bit weird to land this thing. But I'm getting as much science as I possibly can, and to get even more science, we're going to go ahead and get Bob out. He's going to reset everything and then go plant a nice little flag over here just to say that we were here once, and of course get a surface sample. And that pretty much wraps up all that we're going to be doing at this landing spot, because this is actually facing quite a bit away from Kerbin, and I was really afraid that our surface science that we put down isn't going to actually be able to communicate with Kerbin from this spot. So we're going to get Bob back in there and try to use our crater rim launch ramp here to find a better place. It's facing more toward Kerbin and can communicate with it at all times, since the MUN is tidally locked after all. But the crater rim launch was a little bit more complicated than I thought it would be. I was thinking we could just go up the crater and we'd fly away, but it took quite a few tries and some simulated Kerbal deaths to get it actually working. Ended up using that bump right there to pull up as hard as I could and get this thing launching more like a rocket afterward. This can't actually rotate back on its own until it's like free floating in space, so that was very helpful to have that crater rim there to get us going. You can see we can actually see Kerbin now, and that's a good sign that wherever we land at over here, it's going to actually be able to communicate with it at all times. We did kind of land in a crater though, and very close to the dark side of the MUN currently, the night side of the MUN that is currently, so it's a bit dark and contrasty over here, and I don't think our stuff will actually get solar power all the time, but I don't really know if that even truly matters with surface science stuff, because it will get sun eventually, and it's a very long-term science thing anyway. So I did actually manage to land on the butt of the aircraft here, but not for long before it started tipping over, and Bob ended up having to chase everything down while he was just trying to simply reset all of the science experiments. Yeah, my bad. We also didn't have the landing gear out, so this is a full belly landing. Since we need to actually set up some surface science, I went ahead and got Bill out too, and Bill's going to help, well, first plant the flag, and he's going to also be helping out with some of the more engineering-focused surface deployables, like the solar panels and the communication hub and stuff like that actually runs all the surface samples. He's going to be putting all that down because he gives a little boost to all of that stuff, whereas Bob will give a boost to the more sciencey stuff. Right after Bill puts out this solar panel, I went ahead and clicked the what's usually the IVA view button, but with this mod called Through the Eyes of a Kerbal, it actually gives you the Kerbal view of the area, which I think is just really, really cool, and just puts you down in the shoes of an actual Kerbal, and it really adds to the experience, though it's a little bit janky. I would prefer better controls, especially when they're walking, but it's very cool here. You can see Bob set up the little mystery goo viewer there. We also set up a seismometer, which is really going to help us in getting some quick science in the future, we can just chuck something at the MUN and have it crash into the surface of the MUN, and we'll be able to get science from that really quickly without having to worry about launching a whole mission and actually landing here or anything. So that'd be pretty handy. And now it was time to launch, and luckily for us, the front landing gear got like hung in one of those parallax rocks and flung the entire ship up to the exact angle that we needed it to be to launch. So that's pretty darn cool if you ask me, and I'll take it. I'll absolutely take it, because I was worried about trying to actually fly that thing, roll that thing over to that crater rim to launch it, so that was a lot easier than what I even intended it to be. Here I'm just going to directly start burning toward Kerbin and leave the MUN as quick as that, because we have an excess of Delta V. This could probably easily do a Duna mission if we needed it to, so we can easily bring down our orbit without any aerobrake passes and come right down to Sandy Island, which is going to be the place that we land these space planes at. These in particular, I'll probably like pick a different spot for each space plane in the future, just to add a little bit extra challenge to it, and I think it's fun having like a single destination that isn't just the KSC, because I did a lot of KSC landing in the KSP2 version of this series, and it's kind of fun landing at different places with different challenges and approaches and stuff. And of course we're using the angle of attack hold feature that I've been pushing the entire video. Very, very cool. I didn't know that it really existed. I knew it existed, but I hadn't really tried it, and it's very, very awesome for re-entries like this, being able to set your return angle and everything. We're going to go ahead and fly us down to the Sandy Island runway, which is usually I usually end up coming up fairly short and coming in really, really slow for it. But this time we came in at a pretty darn good angle and rotated this thing around and lined it up with the runway, and this might be the very first landing that is somewhat normal of the SO9 Cole. Usually I come in right before the runway, or in the case of the earlier landing, we came in before the runway, and this time we had a completely different thing go wrong. It was a great landing, but we still had all the traction turned up on the wheels from that MUN landing, so it stopped almost instantly. I can imagine that was pretty unpleasant for the Kerbals on board. But pleasantly for us, we got a lot of science from that. Almost 1,000 science from that, like 800, I think, just from the science there. And if we time warp forward, all of those surface experiments actually start paying us as time goes on. So you see we got a little bit back there, and I went ahead and time warped even faster, and we got a couple of hundred extra science points from that. Science points that we're going to go ahead and spend on this node with the legendary Rapier engine. I actually went over to Mission Control like I usually do after all of this to check out what we had available, and thank you guys so much for voting to keep the asteroid around, because if we ever need money again, we can do these 2 missions here to get tourists to Stony Station, and we'll get a good amount of money out of that if we ever need it again. Thank you so much for watching. That's all I've got for this episode, and thank you so much for sticking around for the month between these episodes. Yeah, it literally took me a month to get this one out for various reasons, a loss in the family and several other things. And yeah, I also actually lost an entire hard drive that I had and all the data on it, so I actually lost the original outro. So I hope you like the new outro that was salvaged from some older videos and stuff. I tried to spice it up a little bit, and this also just happens to be the 100th Smooneychad video, technically, if you count the shorts and stuff like that. This is the 100th video, so it's a pretty big milestone on the channel, so I hope you guys enjoyed. I think we're going to be ending up heading to Duna in the next episode, so stick around for that one. As for right now, this is Smooneychad, out.